There are, of course, many books published in the philosophy of religion every year, so I should explain what makes this volume different. It's certainly very large, over 600 pages in all, but looking at the competition, it's not overly expensive and is actually at the lower end of the price scale. But there is a reason for the sheer size of the book, for what I wanted to provide was something truly comprehensive in scope and of real use to both the student and instructor. Those of us who've taught for many years in this field know very well from bitter experience that students have one fairly obvious practical hurdle to overcome, and that is accessibility to the literature. They can't afford the books themselves, or at least not all of them. They go to the library and invariably someone else has got there first. This is a real difficulty. And so what usually happens is that they read around the topic but never read the originals. They read what X says about Plato but never the man himself. I'm very old-fashioned about this sort of thing, and I believe this is a terrible situation. I've always preferred that a student should understand 50% of a primary text than 90% of a secondary source. And so the anthology, when properly organised, fills a real need. The student can now tackle the primary text first-hand. There can be no excuses for not having the texts, and he or she can make up their own mind and not have their minds made up for them by somebody else. The trouble is that more often than not, the method adopted in the anthologies I've seen has not been a happy one. More of the bleeding chunk variety, with little attempt being made to make the primary texts digestible. Now, one look inside my book will very quickly tell you a different story. It's much more user-friendly, and always and at every turn it couples the texts with useful aids to study. And here I'd like to mention very briefly the four main ways in which this has been achieved. First, every text is placed in its historical context, with biographies of all the major philosophers discussed. Again, I think this is very important. Philosophers, both ancient and modern, are not disembodied names, and very often they've led interesting and even exciting lives. Take, for example, the case of Bertrand Russell, who was sent to prison in his 90s. Having this sort of information fleshes out the texts and makes them much more accessible. One is now dealing with real people, after all. The second thing that I'd like to point out is this. Each chapter begins with a general summary of the main topic, whether it be, for example, the argument for God's existence, or the problem of evil, or whatever. These summaries are intended to provide a handy overview, more aide-memoire than detailed analysis. It's not my job to teach the subject, that is something for the professor or instructor to do, but it is nevertheless very useful to have a broad outline of the argument, of the plot, as it were. More unusually, however, it's not just the chapters that have these introductions. Each individual text also gets one of its own. It's unfair to suppose that students are going to plunge happily into Plantinga on free will. They need all the help they can get, and this I provide. Having these text-specific introductions is, as far as I know, an original feature of the book and one not found in any other anthology. The third, and I believe another original feature of the book, is the inclusion at the beginning of every text of an extract-specific bibliography. This is a bibliography, in other words, tailored to the text, not just to the chapter as a whole. So, for example, before the extract, say, of Hume on miracles, one will get the specific bibliography relevant to that text, mentioning not merely the primary sources and various editions available, but also the current literature in which Hume's argument is discussed. And finally, at the end of each chapter, there is a whole apparatus for further study. These include a selection of key texts, always useful for the instructor when compiling shorter book lists, and a very substantial guide to further reading. This guide is often of several pages long and will be particularly useful for those engaged in more detailed research. And lastly, I provide a series of study questions, many of which are taken from current examination papers. These inevitably draw attention to the key areas of interest and have, in my experience, a wonderful effect on the students' concentration levels. By pinpointing specific areas in this way, the instructor can give the students some idea of what to expect in an exam or course requirement. And as I say, it does concentrate the mind wonderfully. The book ends with a clear and uncomplicated index, and I am particularly grateful to Professor Kevin Durand for providing an excellent glossary. Again, something not usually found in books of this sort.